Frontline Club.
Let me open this evening. My name is Milica Pešić. I'm Executive Director of Media Diversity Institute, which is London-based charity, which is co-organizing, co-hosting this event together with the Queen Mary Center for Law, Democracy and Society, Queen Mary University of London. And this is an official British launch of the book Coming Clean by Professor Eric Heinze, official launch here in Britain. I'm talking because I was not sure how the audience would react when you see only men sitting here. So I'm talking, to prove that there is a gender balance because not here on the stage, but behind these three gentlemen, there are a lot of ladies, such as our Rini, such as our Anthea, who is doing the live streaming, such as Dina Newman, who helped us a lot with the whole process of setting up this event. And then also there are people at Gulsha at the school, Queen Mary University. So a lot of women, that's why I can guarantee that the event is going to be very successful. So I'll just introduce the panelists. So apart from Professor Eric Heinze, who, as you know, is the author of the book, we have Dr. Edmundo Bracho, who is a senior lecturer and program coordinator at the University of Westminster Cambridge Center. And we have Paul Henley, who is a BBC radio presenter, who is going to make this discussion very lively and provocative. And we expect not only our panelists, but you here in the audience to come with your questions, but also we have online audience. This is a hybrid event. So we hope that we will have also comments and questions, but primarily questions from the online participants. So enjoy the evening and thank you for coming. Thank you for being interested in the topic. I believe you are all somewhere on the left, but who knows? It would be good to have provocative questions so we can just get better. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Ed, and welcome, Eric. I hope you don't mind me calling you by your first names for the purposes of tonight's talk. So first of all, Eric, congratulations on a very erudite, very thought-provoking book. We're going to hear some of the thoughts that it provokes tonight. And if I can ask you to set out your stall a bit at the beginning, you go out of your way in this book to say that this is not an attack on the left, collective sigh of relief probably here. In the last chapter, you hint that you want to join the left, but only if they change course. What do you mean?
Yeah, well, thank you for starting with a perfectly provocative question, and thank you all, incidentally, for coming. It's really a pleasure to see everybody here. Yes, one of the most important themes in the book, I think, is to try to understand really what the greatest achievements of the left has been. And I know, the left, it's a very, very broad grouping, often entailing strands of thought that are in conflict with each other. Nevertheless, I try to look at some of the dominant strains of progressive thought, for many decades, if not for more than a century. And I just try to come up with my own analysis of what's been missing, because I do think that I'm trying to bring out some points that others have missed.
You say that something's missing from the left's analysis of its thinking. What?
Essentially, it goes like this, right? If we look at the culture wars that have been raging in recent years, the left has become very, very identified with certain readings of history, right? With certain readings of, in particular, the history of Western civilization as having been really based on mass incidents of oppression, exploitation, militarism, racism, colonialism, sexism, heteronormativity. And then you get a right-wing backlash, which essentially does not want to hear any of this, right? In fact, wants to actively dismantle things like diversity programs or queer theory or what have you. And so we end up with these two polar opposites. And what I'm trying to find in the book is a way out of these extreme entrenched positions, right? And so instead of kind of falling into this trap of the far right, of just trying to negate it all, of attacking it all, my argument is that these are very important contributions that the left has made, but that the left has not really done enough to essentially give the same treatment to the histories of regimes to which the left itself has been committed.
Okay, so let's get specific. What are the sins of the left?
Yeah,
History.
okay. Yeah.
Is it as simple as the left points to the Holocaust, right wing's fault, and the left fails to mention Stalin starving to death millions of people in Ukraine in the 30s?
Well,
those good examples.
It's a starting point. It's a starting point. One of the things I try to talk out to explain in the book, because when I make this point, I think many people who see themselves on the left are actually shocked by what I'm saying, because many on the left will say, well, wait a minute, we don't deny the horrors of Stalin. We don't deny the horrors of Mao. We have broken with these traditions. And what I argue in the book is, yes, that far, most people on the left nowadays are willing to go. They are willing to acknowledge that these were atrocious histories. The problem is that when we're looking at Western history, at these histories of Western atrocities, the program on the left is that these are ongoing injustices. We have to learn these centuries of history because, in a sense, they're still with us. Whereas what I argue in the book is that the left is not doing this enough with the histories of atrocities on the left, that instead there's an attempt to make a kind of clean break. We don't do that anymore. This is behind us. And I'm saying history can't work that way. If the history of Western atrocities are still ongoing and still with us, then this must be true also of the crimes of people like Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and others, where again, there may never have been total leftist support, but there was often substantial enthusiasm, or at least a lending of legitimacy to very brutal and violent regimes.
Okay, this is where I bring Ed in as our representative voice of the left. Like it or not, you're cast as that tonight. Does Eric have a point? Are there sins of the left in history that you think should be examined more and more publicly?
Yes, absolutely. And I come from a lived experience as somebody from, let's say, a leftist tradition. I was born and raised in South America, Venezuela, came here to the UK as a child, went back to Venezuela. So I saw a relatively functional democracy at work in that country for some years, until the surge of Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro. As I said, it wasn't a perfect democracy. It's a lot of corruption, but I saw how those democratic or moderately democratic institutions were sort of turned on their heads by a so-called socialist government at the time, a very sort of messianic, personalistic, militarist, which gradually turned authoritarian.
They shut down the newspaper that you co-founded, is that right?
They did indeed, and that was a left-leaning newspaper that gradually became critical of the way Hugo Chavez was, let's say, diminishing and subverting all the liberal democratic institutions that existed, including a free press. So there's the old adage that says the left looks for traitors, the right looks for converts. We were the left, and we were treated as traitors by that government until the newspaper, which was collectively owned, a very beautiful project where we all co-own part of as editors, reporters, journalists, co-own part of that newspaper. But once we started being minimally critical of government, problems began, and ultimately it was shut down. So as I said, I come from a lived experience of that, let's call it radical left. I very much like the stance, let's call it a theoretical stance of one of the newspaper's founders, called Teodoro Petkov, who's half Bulgarian, Christian, half Polish Jewish, raised in a black village in Venezuela. And he said, wrote a book called The Two Lefts, which sadly and not accidentally has never been translated to English. He's called it The Two Lefts. One, he said, it's that progressive left that's still very much alive. I think I can tell, I can talk of Latin America, in the case of Gabriel Boric in Chile. That is a progressive left. But then he also talked about what he defined as a Bourbonic, taking the name from the aristocratic, Spanish house of royal house of the times, Bourbonic left that never forgets but never learns. And you've got shades in between. Yeah? But we saw how gradually this project, this so-called socialist project, turned from a rhetoric that was progressive to one that became very Bourbonic or Diluvian, après-moi le déluge, and personalistic.
Eric, do you think that the left, perhaps more in this country, we've had a sort of an example from Venezuela, but do you think the left, in a way, its most comfortable position is victimized because it's easy to cast the right as the arch enemy? Does the left thrive as persecuted?
Well, there are plenty of people on the right now who are thriving as persecuted. So I'm not sure that's ever been just the preserve of the left. I would say we observe similar things on the right now for quite a while, arguably a few decades.
Most effectively powerfulizes, weaponizes victimhood.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't necessarily want to give a first prize for that, but I mean, it is certainly true that, yeah, sure. I mean, look, there's nothing wrong, and I try to make this very clear in the book, right? I mean, of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to stand up for underdogs, wanting to find oppression and wanting to battle it. And there again, so I don't, at no point do I challenge leftist ideas of oppression, either in principle or how it's worked out. I simply say that they've essentially ignored one half of it that has taken place over, the better part of a century, if not longer. And again, when I say ignore it, I'm not saying that they deny it, right? Again, for the most part, people on the left are willing to acquiesce, they're willing to concede these atrocities, but it's never taken any further, right? When it comes to Western atrocities, right, we get, documentaries, films, training programs, protests, and so forth. But if a defining feature of the left is self-critique, it's collective self-critique, that can't just be for the West to do for itself, that also has to be for the left to do for itself. And in the same ways, openly, actively, we have to see it. We also have to see those training programs and films and documentaries, right? It can't only be one half of the history of oppression of the last 100 years.
Is there anyone in the audience who feels that the left, as we're calling it, is coming unfairly under attack here? A point somebody would like to make, or a question to put to Eric? Need a microphone. How do we do it? Use that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your book, Eric. I haven't read it yet, but I will in time. And I thought about this before I even came here, but it still chimes with what you're saying. And this is really, I just wanted to question this. Seems to be this idea of some sort of ethical purity that's being strived for. That we need to, atone for our sins of the left. And I can understand why that might be, but my question is, what is the purpose of that? Because the people running the show at the moment, that we're all concerned about, couldn't care less about any kind of ethical purity. It's so far away from their concerns, it's so far off the scale. So I wonder why is this important now? And what is the purpose of it? What do we, if we did achieve it, if we went through these in these dark corners and said, yeah, we need to look at this more, then what?
The answer is credibility. It is simply not credible to tell a whole civilization that it needs to critically self-scrutinize when the people who are teaching this message don't do it. Right? Essentially, one of the points I make in the book is that, one of the essential aims of much of the left over decades now, in their own words, has been to tell the untold stories. Yeah, to get away from history as just the high deeds of great men, from Alexander the Great to Churchill, right? And instead to look at the untold stories of colonial peoples, of slaves, of women, of LGBTQ people, and so forth. Yeah. What I think the left does not appreciate yet is that all of those untold stories are being told upon a high heap of untold stories that they keep untold, because there have also been millions, tens of millions of lives damaged and destroyed through regimes to which the left had been deeply committed. Why would you care that we're all self-scrutinizing if you're not doing it yourself? Why would you care? And so one of the final sentences in my book is, yeah, self-scrutiny, that's good. Democracy requires it. I'm not telling you to stop it, but don't tell us, show us.
You also talk in the book about the dangers of the kind of self-scrutiny that you're recommending. And you say that there's a bit of a buzz there. Keep the mic this way. All right. You talk about the danger of this public scrutiny of the left, and you said it nearly stopped you writing the book because nobody wants to see the right-wing media declaring that leftists admit they were cheerleading for mass murder. And you give the example of Hungary in the 2000s, when the then liberal prime minister said in private in a political meeting, we screwed up and we have to admit that we lied for the past 24 months. This got out and it led to Orban getting into power. So there are risks, aren't there?
100%. But I think the gains will be greater. One of the most important points I think that I make in the book, and so I try to make it at the very beginning, right? And I can read you the page where I say conservatives have done no better, right? Well, one of my sentences in the book is that many conservatives come very late to the table of historical responsibility. Some cannot even find the door. So the point of the book is not to suggest that conservatives have done any better with history. They haven't. In fact, this is often something where the left has taken the lead, and I think we have to be absolutely clear about that, and I think thankful for it. Again, democracy depends on this. Democracy depends on our ability to critically scrutinize our history in terms of things like mass injustice. Otherwise, what's the point of democracy? Which gets back to another point that you just raised, because you didn't use the term far right, but of course it's what you're rightly discussing. Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that the same people who are leading these attacks on critical scrutiny of history are the ones who are dismantling democracy altogether. And that's why I think I do not attack the left. I hope that this is a recipe for saving it, for reinvigorating it.
But you are talking about a sort of race for the moral high ground, which is the point that the gentleman was making.
And you don't ever get to the moral high ground by telling people to do things that you don't do yourself, just as openly, just as publicly, just as zealously, just as energetically, right? And I cannot think of a single university campus, right? One of the things I say in the book is, right, we have things in universities, right? And not just in universities, like, Women's History Month, LGBTQ History Month, Black History Month. That's good. I don't attack that. I say, keep doing it. How about a Socialist History Month? And again, not done by the far right, done by leftists themselves to show us how to do what they think the rest of us need to do.
So you're not attacking woke. What is your definition of wokery?
Critique through self-critique, and that was a Bolshevik saying. Those were the Bolsheviks who all got shot. The ones who said, we can only credibly do critique through self-critique. They were the ones who got shot. So I'm trying to rescue them from the dead.
Can we plug a couple of well, no, you comment on that and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a point. I think it's a good thing that wokeism as a term is on its way out.
Is it really on its way out?
It is. For me, it's a rhetorical.
By the right.
Well, exactly. But it
doesn't mean
gradually, but it will be. It's a rhetorical device which now is being used to discredit progressive values and activism, left-wing activism. It's highly ambiguous. I much prefer, although identity politics, for example, or intersectionality. It did have its purpose, I think, wokeism as a term. And I think that ambiguity in the term and that politicizations are central to its analysis. I don't see it as a coherent ideology either. And it's something that it's becoming much weaponized, as you say, by the right wing, increasingly polarized.
Would anyone like to speak for or against the survival of wokeism? About the English language.
Okay, I'm just going to go for wokeism. I think it's a wonderful expression. Oh, lots of feedback. I thought it had something particularly to do with Black consciousness through slavery and in the United States. And I think it's extremely important that that element still is retained and then carried through into a sort of critical consciousness of consciousness raising for people who have been ignored and oppressed and historically seen in that way. So I think it's a great expression.
Which is classic territory for the left, isn't it, Eric? Awareness of colonialism, slavery in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I throw around the term woke, 2 or 3 times in the book. I'm not deeply wedded to it. I don't know if it's coming or going. It's a colloquial term. It was never meant to do that much work or to carry that much weight. Well, the point I try to make in the book is I'm not anti-woke, but I want a new woke. Again, which brings in the promise of critique as self-critique with which modern leftists began and which totally fell by the wayside and which has just been absent now for decades, certainly in our lifetimes, and has to come back, because you look back at the recent United States elections, and ever since last November, we have these ongoing discussions about, what did the Democrats get wrong? What has the left been doing wrong? And you get a lot of answers are about tweaking the message. Well, maybe don't talk so much about trans athletes in sports and maybe talk a little bit more about, kitchen table issues. And I think it goes much deeper than just tweaking the message and saying a little bit less of this and a little bit more of that. I think we really have to look at what we mean by progressive.
A couple of big topics that you give a lot of time. Yeah. Oh, questions online. Why don't we go to those now? There you go.
I don't think it's online.
No, this is not an online question. This is a question from me. I could not keep silent at this point, Eric, when you mentioned that there is a tradition of self-critique from the Bolsheviks. I'm sorry, from the very, very start, the whole point of Lenin's project was against any self-critique whatsoever. He had the only correct ideology. Whoever wanted to self-critique or indeed to critique him ended up as Mensheviks, right? So when we're talking about Bolsheviks, about Lenin, about that tradition that won in that particular country and then spread further into Eastern Europe, that was totally against self-critique from the very start. I'm sure that there are some other wonderful examples of self-critique elsewhere on the left, but don't look towards Moscow.
Yeah, no, but Dina, you know, I agree entirely with, you know, with the history, you know, that you've just recited. And I certainly don't mean that this ever made its way up to the ranks of Lenin. You're absolutely right. You know, but, you know, at that point, it became a meaningless term and even an oppressive term. Right. You know, as you and I have discussed before, then the idea of self-critique just became the opposite, right? It just became, you know, a kind of way of openly conforming to an imposed ideology at the risk of one's life often. And so, you know, I think you and I entirely agree on that. Nevertheless, I do think, you know, that there was an ideal of a better idea, of a better kind of progressive thought. But I don't mean to say that it was ever you know, genuinely adopted and practiced. It could have been and should be.
Sorry to intervene. Eric, it's Gorsh here. We've got someone online who'd like to ask a question. Gavin, if you'd like to unmute your mic.
Hi, Eric.
Hi, Gavin.
Hi. I know you don't cover this in the book, but since work has come up, I can't resist asking you, because we mentioned it a couple of times in our chats. What do you make of the kind of, I don't know whether it's a growing movement, but some notable books that have critiqued woke from a left-wing perspective and said it's been a wrong turn by the left? I'm thinking of Susan Neyman's The Left is Not Woke, Yasha Monk's The Identity Trap, which have sort of critiqued the obsession with identity and with siloing people off in little kind of discrete cultures who can't mutually understand each other or say things about each other, and also the obsession with policing language. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I know it's not central to your book.
Well, Gavin, I think nobody will appreciate more than you what I'll call the tale of two lovers. Lover number one says, you always leave stacks of dirty dishes in the sink and your socks on the floor. Lover number two says, you always leave stacks of dirty dishes in the sink and your socks on the floor. But I admit that I always forget to turn the lights out and that I often waste money. Number one, which one do you believe more? Which one would you rather engage with? I think the answer should be obvious. But more importantly, notice that lover number two didn't have to change the criticisms. Lover number two is still attacking you, right, for always leaving the dirty dishes in the sink and your socks on the floor. What changes with lover number two is not the criticism, it's not what's being said, it's the context. The context completely changes, right? So you could have discussions about whether you really do leave the dishes and the socks on the floor, right? And that would be kind of more Susan Neyman's approach, right? Let's actually look at these claims and examine them. I want to take a different approach. I'm not going to attack the claims. I'm going to ask, how are you putting forward these claims? Again, if these claims are about the West having to collectively self-scrutinize, how are you showing us all publicly, openly, your own collective self-scrutiny?
And there's a question from our audience online. Veronica Majkowska is writing, some say that woke culture that empowers, in inverted commas, minorities, especially people of color, is inherently racist because it is indirectly saying that people of color cannot reach those positions on their own. What do you think of that take?
You know, again, woke, it's a catchphrase, right? You can't expect a catchphrase to do a lot of work or to be the basis for a highly comprehensive and coherent view of the world, right? Nobody speaks slang that way, right? And so I'm not expecting this term, you know, to be the key to our salvation. I kind of pick it up a little bit from popular culture. Again, it barely comes up in the book. You know, I want to try to get to really more essential things. And it is true, some people have criticized the idea that woke suggests that everyone else is asleep, right? You know, and fair enough, there is something simplistic in that, but this is just the way language works. You know, it's a catchphrase. What I want to do is get beyond, you know, this kind of name calling and you know, and really look at problems in a much more systematic way.
A couple of themes that you spend quite a lot of time on in your book, the Ukraine war, the traditional left approach being that, yes, Putin was wrong to invade, but it was partly the West's fault. Look at what NATO did. Maybe we can discuss that. And the other is modern anti-Semitism and the classic Corbynista defense. Anti-Semitism belongs exclusively to the right. We can't be. Maybe you could start with that and the discussion that you have, and I'll get Ed to reply to it. The discussion that you had about Guardian journalist and Corbyn, and just explain the point that you made briefly, could you, Ed?
No, I just wanted to add something about what the question just being asked, and I do think, and this is a critique that comes from the left. The whole wokeism debate and the use of that term, it takes energy away from the broader concern of the left, which is class consciousness, class politics, economic justice, and it becomes much more about very subjective narratives that also feed into these little compartments of minority-sized communities or groups. And my point about trying to do away with this term, it's because I see that it hasn't got much longevity, and it's also being weaponized by the far right. So you know, that's to follow up on what you were saying, Eric. And this is a critique that comes from the hard left, from the Marxist left. The class struggle, it's hardly looked at in wokeism. It becomes more about issues of, you know, race, separate at times, although we've got the, you know, the specter of intersectionality doing the rounds there, but it becomes, you know, sort of a signifier that's somehow separate from ethnicity and or gender and or sexual orientation and or religious and faith beliefs, etc.
Thank you. Eric, anti-Semitism and the left.
Let me start with Ukraine, which you mentioned, yeah, because I think this is a really important jump-off point, right? Again, I'm going to use the example of what goes on in universities, although it certainly stretches well beyond, but universities, I think, just give us a very clear example. You know, again, much of the life of universities throughout the Western world, you know, has been, you know, things like not only teaching about things like racism and patriarchy and heteronormativity and so forth, but again, carrying that into cultural events, programs, documentaries, often protests and demonstrations. And again, I think that's good. I think that should continue. But if the left, as many on the left would insist, is fundamentally based on starting from a position of self-scrutiny, starting with where have we gone wrong? When Putin marched into Ukraine, we would have had protests everywhere against Putin. Because if the left is about self-scrutiny, well, how did this whole configuration come about? of Russian domination of Ukraine and then aggression in Ukraine, if not through a 100-year history, which again, many on the left supported. And so if the left is fundamentally about self-critique, where were those protests?
It was the fault of the left that there weren't mass protests against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Anyone want to reply to that one? Ed.
No, I can add something, and in my more sort of area of expertise, if there is ever one, which is media, I think some of the left, or a lot of the left, see that conflict in a very, or through a campist lens, through, you know, the sort of two camps, yes? Dividing the world into a kind of the imperialist West and its opponents. And although they might not see Russia as, or Putin's Russia as a liberator, they certainly see it as a counterweight to Western liberal democracy. And they make this sort of, for me, very infantile equation. Russia is anti-NATO, anti-EU, anti-USA, anti-Western power. Hence, it's one of us. Okay? Hence, we need to understand or downplay Russia's aggression to Ukraine.
And yet there isn't anyone publicly on the left who does not condemn the invasion, is there? Or is there?
I'm so glad that you brought up that point. I mentioned three very prominent figures on the left when I'm discussing Ukraine, and a few others, but mostly Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, Slavoj Žižek. What's interesting here is that actually Chomsky took a position completely opposite to that of Žižek and Butler, although all three are very influential on the left. And so superficially, you might say, aha, that proves that you can't generalize about the left. We have a great diversity of views and so forth. Yeah, because Chomsky was pretty much saying that Ukraine should just capitulate. It's all the fault of the West, you know, and it's all because of the West has been constantly aggressing Russia. Whereas Butler and Žižek were saying, no, you know, this is really about the Kremlin, about Kremlin, a long, you know, history really of Kremlin aggression. So it would seem at the surface that there's a real disagreement there. What I argue is that you dig deeper, they're all doing the same thing, these three thinkers, and many more who have intervened. Namely, none of them start from the position of our political home was deeply implicated for the better part of a century in lending legitimacy to Kremlin imperialism.
I mean, Soviet Russia.
Yes, yes.
But that's a very different entity from Putin's Russia today. Or
No, not in the least. It is one autocracy, Tsarism, yielding to another autocracy, Soviet Union, yielding to the next, Putin. And too many on the left say, oh yeah, but the Cold War is over. Oh, Soviet Union, that's not there anymore. Yeah, it's still there. It's called autocracy. And indeed, getting back to this problem of the far right, I think there's a question that really needs to be asked, right, from on the left, and I don't hear it being asked. What is it that you don't like about Trump? What Trump is doing, above all, is hollowing out democratic institutions. What don't you like about that? You spent 100 years supporting regimes right up to Chavez, right up to our own lifetimes, supporting regimes that hollow out democracy. That's a modus operandi. So is it that you would be perfectly happy with Trump if you were just doing the same thing on the left? Because if so, you've got a real problem. If so, you really haven't understood your own history in the least. And so you have to think twice about teaching history to the rest of us. Because this fundamental problem, and here, incidentally, getting back to Gavin's point about Susan Nyman, here I think there is a convergence. It's that both on the far right and on the far left, we have some pretty bleak histories of supporting regimes that were anti-democratic, that hollowed out democratic institutions. Yeah, well, again, one of the things I say in the book is I'm not talking about everyone on the left or only the left.
You are.
But what I'm
You
talking,
are talking exclusively about the very far left. It's only the very far left that has spent history trying to hollow out democratic institutions. It's not the Liberal Democrats, is it?
well, again, that's why I use the phrase lending legitimacy. It's true that not everybody on the left was zealously supporting Stalin, right? Or the Soviet Union generally. That's certainly true, right? But unfortunately, it was very much, and often with the best of intentions. I never impugn anyone's intentions in this book, but even with the best of intentions, lending legitimacy. And again, not just to Stalin, not just to the Soviet Union, but to a whole series of the most brutal, violent, murderous regimes. And that at some point, that's just not an accident.
Anyone want to come back on that? No? Well, let's move on to the idea that anti-Semitism can only exist and flourish on the right. What's the point that you make in the book about that?
Well, I made that in a very, very particular context, right? When we had, the 5 years of Corbyn's leadership, one of the things I try to point out in the book is there was, again, we had a whole, obviously this was, very, very controversial. We had a whole range of responses on the left. There again, there was not any one single leftist position. There was a lot of disagreement on the left itself about how much there was, whether it existed, whether it was worse than anyone else, and so forth. Now, a very, very interesting voice in all of this is that of Owen Jones. I don't think I have to explain to anybody here who Owen Jones is, right? The Guardian journalist.
Yeah, maybe do explain who he is.
And okay, well,
he is a Guardian journalist. Yes. He's an opinion columnist for the left, and he's a columnist for the Guardian. He's outspoken and controversial, and he's relatively young.
And very, 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 very critical of Israel, right? He has really led, after October the 7th, almost immediately, Owen Jones was pretty much consistently criticizing Israeli policy and Israeli actions. And so therefore I figured, okay, I'm going to look at Owen Jones. I'm going to use him as a source, because certainly no one can then, accuse me of using a source which would be pro-Israel. Because if Owen Jones is not critical of Israel, I don't know who is. So that was my starting point. Because what was also interesting about Owen Jones was that many people, on the sort of solid left of the Labour Party, many people have been critical of Israel. In that respect, Jones is not unique at all. What was interesting about Jones, nevertheless, was that when these anti-Semitic incidents started erupting, he was actually quite open about them. He acknowledged them, right? Whereas others were kind of saying, it's all just a Mossad plot or whatever. And in fact, at the end of Corbyn's leadership, he devoted a whole chapter in his book to the problem of anti-Semitism under Corbyn, and he, gave a whole recitation. And I checked every single incident, and all of them were, none of them have been disproved. And so Owen Jones was going through incident after incident after incident that was anti-Semitic. But the problem is this: when Jones first took it up, right, as you noticed, Paul, and again, this was still kind of in the very beginning of Corbyn's leadership, when the problem was still sort of just erupting after a flare-up in 2014 in the Middle East. And at that point, Jones was saying, essentially, this is really a right wing. This is a far right phenomenon. So we on the left have to kind of steer clear on it. 5 years later, he was no longer saying this. Right? So 5 years later, he was saying, yes, there is genuine anti-Semitism on the left. We have to deal with it. But what falling into your line of thinking, maybe. No. Okay, I know you're going to say no, but no. It seems like he's coming towards you at this point. No. Appearances can be deceptive. Yeah, and again, I don't impugn his goodwill, his good intentions. I think he really thought that he was doing some proper leftist self-scrutiny. The problem was this, right? You read, Owen Jones, as you know, writes on everything. He writes on poverty, on racism, on sexism, on LGBTQ issues. And in each of those, he always diagnoses these, and he sometimes literally uses the words systemic, structural, right? Systemic poverty in British history, systemic racism, systemic sexism, systemic heteronormativity, right? He uses the word, and if he's not using the word, he's certainly using the concepts. Again, I don't attack him for this, as the far right would do, right? I think it's interesting. You may agree, you may disagree, but it's worth thinking about what's meant here by systemic oppression or exclusion or discrimination. The problem was when he did this bit about anti-Semitism on the left, again, he recited incident after incident after incident after incident, sometimes at the highest ranks of the party. But he never used this idea of systemic or structural. He kept presenting it as just a mistake. You know, oh, well, you know, Corbyn should have spoken up a bit earlier, or, you know, this one should have passed a message to that one. It was just a lot of banana peels. Yeah, it was just, oops. How can this be? How can this be? Usually when he uses, again, a word like systemic to talk, say, about someone like Stephen Lawrence, he doesn't even necessarily cite 50 other examples.
So he creeps towards proper self-analysis that you would have approved of, and then lets everyone on the left off the hook, is your conclusion?
Yeah, he ends up with the opposite.
Do you want to comment on that, Ed?
Yes, I mean, we see now how, you know, US Republicans and conservatives are now being disgraced for not criticizing Donald Trump, and maybe to a lesser degree, Orban here in Europe, or Netanyahu, and rightly so. I believe very rightly so, they should be criticized. But like Owen Jones, do we see these, you know, public intellectuals do the same for leftist leaders or towards leftist regimes? I've not read any piece by Jones about the Castros, or, you know, the national catastrophe that's going on in Nicaragua now under the Ortegas. So, you know, they do need to do that.
It sounds like you two are in accord on this one.
Yes, yeah, although I do make the distinction that, and I think that came from a couple of you here in the audience, that I would make the distinction between radical crits and crits. Yeah, I think that there's a difference. You know, in the book, we see how Eric sort of puts this sort of leftist broad church, sort of all of them together.
You talk about crits. It's not your phrase, Eric, but just explain what crits are in this book. You use it hundreds of times.
Yeah, well, you know, again, I'll do my little plug here, right? The book, Coming Clean, it's called The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. And what I meant, you know, right, with that, you know, with that full title, is to kind of capture really, you might say, two strands, although of course there are many strands. Critical theory, that's the more intellectual, the more academic strand, right? And the very phrase critical theory or critical race theory, or, you know, these were only recently did they even hit the mass media. For decades, they were only the, you know, the language of academics, and not even of that many of them. Whereas when I talk about the future of left, then I'm talking more broadly, right? About, you know, politicians, activists, or even just, you know, ordinary people. And so, yeah, critical theory, but nevertheless, as what has very much been the brains of the left, you know, because even people, you know, like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, or, you know, whoever they may be, or Owen Jones, you know, even if they themselves don't have academic careers, you know, you can tell that there's a lot of flowing back and forth of ideas here. You know, these people don't exist in cells isolated from each other. And so critical theorists, even if they are focused on the academy, may even write and speak in rather arcane ways, have had a very, very deep influence. In fact, I go so far as to say that they have very much created our modern conceptions of justice. Even if we disagree on particular points right? It's very much critical theorists, progressives, who have defined the arguments that we have. In fact, I call this in the book the greatest achievement of the left.
Where is the left going wrong on Gaza in condemning Israeli policy in Gaza?
It's not going wrong in its compassion. It's gone wrong in its one-sided readings of history. And so I explain it this way. There are a number of paradigms, right? A number of templates or models that we use to discuss the Middle East. Colonialism, racism, power hierarchies, diplomatic military hierarchies, economic hierarchies, linguistic hierarchies. All of these templates are used to analyze the situation. We could go through all of them, but let me just take two examples because they're quite prominent in the discussions. Let's take racism and colonialism. Here again, you get a culture war. On the one hand, right, you'll get, harsh critics of Israel who, for whom racism, colonialism, these are the exclusive templates. So I will read article after article where it's not even up for discussion, right? It's just from the outset, it's just assumed that Israel is a racist and colonial entity. End of discussion. And then you just build on that and draw your conclusion. Then, of course, again, you get the backlash, right? Which is just, saying that it's anti-Semitic even to suggest such a thing. Here again, I want to break out of these entrenched extremes. My argument is that, yeah, let's talk about racism. I mean, my God, there's racism all over the world. Why wouldn't there be in Israel? I can't think of a country where there are not problems of racism, or at least not many, right? Of course, racism is a problem everywhere. Why wouldn't it be a problem in Israel? And colonialism, yeah, fine. I wouldn't equate, Israel with, sort of British colonial administrators, but to look for colonial patterns, I think that's a legitimate discussion to have. But as I said before, this is only half the history. That's only half the history. What, again, about the history of leftist support, say, for the Kremlin during the Cold War, when it was pouring massive anti-Semitism into the Middle East? When it was massively structuring governments in the Middle East, which some of them started to look essentially like the Kremlin, right? Where is that history, right? I'm willing to have the debates about racism and colonialism. Where is the other 50% of the history? That's my goal. Show me the encampment where they're doing this. If the left is about self-critique, where is the encampment that they're doing this?
Are you making a firebrand defense of moderation here? Are you saying if ideologies are too rigid and too insulated, then they fail, and everyone should consider both sides because it's a very angry way of putting it?
I think we have to get angry at lack of moderation because I think that's what's missing in the Middle East is moderation. But every year the extremism just increases on all sides. So I'm happy to be angry about a lack of moderation.
Good.
I invite you all to join me.
Ed, make the point, and then I'd like to hear.
But Eric, how much historical context do you need in that hyper complex conflict? How much historicism do we need to sort of understand, to come to to terms with the current conflict, which is something very specific? And I think here is where the Western media, it's not doing its duty. There is erasure of context on the one hand by most of the Western media. It sort of very often presents violence in isolation, ignoring the struggle, the dispossession, the inequalities of the Palestinian people. There's also language framing. And that, it's something I think very relevant to MDI. For example, you can use words such as freedom fighters versus terrorists, or Israeli clashes when it's the Israeli defense forces, or escalations. But the Palestinians will generally be acts of terrorism. So the framing, the semantics here are very important, and the Western media is losing that. It's not, I don't see as practicing journalism coverage in an ethical way. You've got asymmetry of coverage. Who are the sources? Are they visible in our news coverage? The Palestinian people, even the Palestinian authorities. I'm not talking about Hamas, I'm talking about people there. Whereas, very often in the coverage of from the, let's call it the Israeli side, we've got official voices. The Minister of Defense, diplomatic sources, members of the Knesset, and so on. So this obviously feeds into that left that is automatically sympathetic to the Palestinian cause.
Anyone got a point on this? Dauntingly big.
Yeah, there's a hand.
Yeah. Thank you. It's not about that, but it's about your idea of structure. What you mean by structure and systemic, because you said at the beginning that the left's perspective is one in which we need to keep talking about this because these are ongoing injustices that are kind of embedded or emerge from the structure of, I don't know, modern capitalist society, I guess, or and that racism and sexism or whatever are all kind of products of a capitalist economy or the nation state system or something along those lines, and they're kind of structural at that level, right? Whereas on the left, the ones you're talking about, if you're talking about like the history of the Soviet Union or those kind of structures, most of them don't exist anymore, really. I'm being provocative, but they don't exist anymore. And I don't think you can make a straight line between the end of the Soviet Union and Putin without taking into account Russian nationalism, for example, in the middle. I think that's a huge.
Oh, yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, so from the left's perspective, structurally, the things that you're talking about aren't structural. They kind of exist at their level of ideology or whatever. And you can see this, I think, because, for example, so you're separating wokeism. You're saying woke is good, right? We need more of it. That's what you're saying. But for the critics of that kind of turn to wokeism actually is another form of authoritarianism, right? It was being imposed a set of language, a set of behavioral codes or whatever. The issue is it was being imposed through maybe, I don't know, HR departments, right? Not the state, really. And now with Trump, you see, actually, they didn't really have that much structural power, right? You weren't being arrested or pulled off the street for not using the right pronouns or whatever. As a kind of objectionable, some of the HR stuff might have been. It's a different form of structural power. So I think this idea of structure seems to be pivotal to your argument. I was kind of interested in how you think about that and how you dealt with it.
Well, I would just get back to your example about Russia. It was, as to Russian nationalism, far from coming, after the end of the Cold War, it was Vladimir Lenin himself who said, scratch a Russian Bolshevik and you'll find a Russian nationalist. And so, the point, Matt, though, is, I don't want to get, the fundamental point here is that there's an absolute continuity in autocracy. Fine, I will grant, for argument's sake, right, that the autocratic ideology, right, or ideological structure of the Soviet Union is rather different from that of Putin, but I see that at a very surface level. Fundamentally, there is a continuity of autocracy. And again, I don't think that the left has taken this seriously at all, right? And again, in the book, I try to, I show how these analyses of the Ukraine war always start from 1990 on the left, right? Chomsky as an example. Also, well, if you look back to, after the Soviet Union, well, okay, yes, let's look at that. Let's look at that. But what about those, decades of the Soviet Union? Why does the left not think it needs to comment on this? And I think it's because it would have to deal with the fact that it was in fact lending, at the very least, legitimacy and sometimes enthusiastic support. And again, not just to the Kremlin.
I want to go back to Gaza, Israel, and the media. I went by chance to these demonstrations of protest in front of Downing Street 2 weeks ago, where I discovered something I haven't heard of, at least not in British media, that there is quite strong opposition to Netanyahu from different organizations within Israel. So why don't we hear about these people who are opposing Netanyahu, who are Israeli, Jewish? Why we don't hear it in British media? And then related to your book, and this is a question for both of you, and maybe for you, Paul, because you come from BBC, and then coming clean, what do you think, Eric, the media should do to open discussion on these issues? This will be a nice guidance for Media Diversity Institute and our future work.
Oh, well, I mean, that second question I can answer in one word: everything.
Hang on, what was the question?
What should the media do?
The media do everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything. Again, I think it has to do what the left has always promised to do, to tell the untold stories.
Do the media obstruct self-criticism of the left and the right by just loving a polemic, liking an argument, and encouraging opposite views to be shouted? Is that an issue?
Well, now I would want to know, which media are you talking about?
Well,
Do you mean more social media or mainstream media or legacy?
I'm talking about mainstream media, broadcast media.
Allowing nothing but shouting. You, a BBC presenter, are saying that they allow nothing but shouting of opposite sides.
Saying is that a tendency of the media that contributes to the problem that you're talking about?
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the fascinating things, and maybe you've encountered this with some of your BBC colleagues, is the first thing you'll hear from them is, oh, yes, of course, there's no such thing as neutrality. There's no such thing as objectivity. Of course, there's always a bias. But they'll never tell you what their own is, if you ask. It's, in other words, what they mean is it's everyone else who can never be neutral and objective, but nobody. So you say to them, well, what's your bias? Which I've often asked, incidentally. It's always something heroic. Oh, well, yes, I guess, I have a bias in favor of the oppressed. Oh, yeah, congratulations. That's not bias. That's not bias at all, right? And so I think, yes, the media has to get serious, because it's anybody in the media will tell you, oh, yes, of course, no such thing as neutrality and objectivity. And yet none of them will ever name it. And then if you point to them, well, what about, then it's only ever factual errors. Oh, yes, of course, well, we corrected that. I mean, is that not a glaring contradiction?
Yeah. I think we've got at least a triple problem there. One is the lack of trust in the media.
I would suggest, can I make a quick suggestion on that one, why we don't hear a lot in the British media about criticism of Netanyahu at home? It's because although there is widespread opposition to Netanyahu in Israel, there is not widespread opposition to the war. And that's why there was huge coverage of the anti-Netanyahu marches in Israel before October the 7th. There was, about the strikes and the demonstrations, but most of Israel, opinion polls suggest well over 90%, is together in terms of what they should be doing about stopping Hamas. That's why, I think. Just a suggestion.
I mean, it is a very difficult time for, call it broadcast, news media, let's call it traditional or legacy media right now. This issue of growing lack of trust by the people in those kind of outlets. There is the issue of information bubbles and echo chambers as well. And this is very much spurred or at least promoted by social media, which tend to configure a very binary reading of reality. And ironically or paradoxically, traditional media seems to be more and more reliant on social media. So it's almost a catch-22 situation. You are between a rock and a hard place. Difficult times for journalism and especially traditional media.
A quick one, and then
yeah.
I'm going to get a question from online. Is that what you're flagging? From you? Excellent. Well, go on, Ed, finish your point, sorry.
And, here we're dealing with, and these very much present, prevalent in your book, Eric, how the Western liberal democratic values seem to be gradually being eaten up, cannibalized by the rise of populist authoritarianism, sorry. And we tend, I see, to throw around this name, populist leader here and populist leader there. I think we've got to be a bit more, let's say, technical about what we mean by populism and, for example, what we mean by fascism, which again, another term that we see thrown around, pretty much everywhere. I can tap into that later on if you'd like me to.
Okay, hi there. What I wanted to mention was, you mentioned that social media, obviously people rely on social media. In regards to Gaza, people have to rely on social media because the Israelis are not letting mainstream press in. And what I find quite interesting as well is I don't know if it's a colonial mindset, a white privilege mindset, a Western superiority mindset. Why can't the journalists in Gaza be trusted for what they're saying? They can. And this is a problem. A lot of people don't take what they say at face value because they are brown and mostly Muslim. And that is a massive issue. And when it comes to the BBC and Sky News, for example, you have Jonathan Levy, a Zionist, who's head of Sky News. Nice guy, I've met him, yeah, a couple of times, but he's head of Sky News. BBC, Rafi Berg, head of the Middle East desk. He is, well, I've got to be careful what I say here, but I've heard, apparently he was working for an American agency with 3 letters, beginning with C, ending in A, and also an asset for Israel. And he's very proud of his work for those institutions, organizations. So therefore, how can the mainstream media be trusted? How can it, how can it not be biased? Yeah, that's my question, sorry.
Thank you.
After Matt, I think we could combine the two, maybe. So there's again, Veronica Majkowska is asking, I have a question for Professor Heinze. You started off this lecture highlighting the importance of the left learning from its crimes in the past, while giving the example of Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine in the 1930s, committed by Joseph Stalin. In that case, why are you not more critical of the current famine in Gaza and the silence from leftist parties in the West, such as Labour Party here in the UK?
That was for you, Eric. So why? Yeah, and then can I help answer the Gaza question as well, about the media specifically?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I mean,
yeah, deliberate starvation of people in Gaza.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear about what the book is doing, right? Because I mean, although obviously, the book does branch out into these other areas, but what I'm trying to do in the book is go back to the starting point. Again, there is no understanding of mass injustice as we understand that concept today outside of critical readings of history, right? And you're right. And all I'm trying to do is balance out this history in the left's own interest. I don't think that the left has made very impressive progress by only focusing on very selected histories while teaching the rest of us that we shouldn't be selective about our histories. Okay, so I want to be clear about why I talk about the Holodomor and other such atrocities, right? Again, the left is very vocal on, on Gaza. Fine, this Keir Starmer's Labour Party, okay, that's not really a subject of my book. I'm really talking again about people, critical theorists, about people who identify, as being progressives, right? As kind of pushing leftist thought forward. And again, they, for the most part, have been very vocal about all situations that they see as resulting from histories of Western oppression. And that's good. Again, I don't attack it. I praise it. I say, keep doing it. But you have left out 50% of world history, and that does falsify how things like Ukraine are discussed and understood, how Israel, Gaza are discussed and understood, and many other situations. So I'm not saying less than that or more than that. I think there's a question, yeah.
I can try and address your question. I did mention what I believe is the lack of symmetry in the coverage of the Gaza conflict or war. The imbalance in sources, the othering, which is something you mentioned, the othering of those, let's call it civil journalism, or communitarian journalism that's going on by people in Gaza, partly because the Israeli government will not allow, Western media to go into Gaza. Right. Yes.
Just
yeah.
very quick one on that.
And
can I just talk about the journalism in Gaza, broadcast journalism in Gaza?
Yeah, I just want to flag up that you mentioned white privilege, but I also see in this sort of othering that I think the Arab neighboring countries have a lot to say as well. I mean, they could be way more supportive. Media outlets like Al Jazeera, they're doing their part, but I think politically they should be doing a lot more.
I'll just quickly answer this one, and then we'll come to your question. I'm not going to try to define or defend BBC policy on Gaza reporting. I'm not in a position to do that, but I would say that on BBC World Service, which is my line of work, we hear absolutely daily from journalists in Gaza whose word is taken, who speak live on air, who speak through translators. Today, I did an interview with the father of a 13-year-old boy who'd been badly injured in a drone attack, and he was trying to get him out of Gaza for treatment, and Israel was blocking it. It's a terrible problem that there are no outside journalists in Gaza, but we have to work with what we've got, and we absolutely credit Gazan journalists to do their job, and they're on daily. Their voices are heard daily, perhaps not so much domestically, but on the World Service, absolutely daily, and it's hugely important. You're right. Question.
It's for Professor Heinze. Oh, yeah, sorry. You mentioned the left's best interests briefly a little bit ago, and I'm just trying to more so understand the concept of critique through self-critique, which I found very fascinating. I'm trying to understand, in saying that, would it be the case that by turning the critical lens more inwards with regards to the left, that getting them to expose perhaps their own contradictions and whatever else may be would actually act as a strength and make the left more appealing in getting across everything once it gets across with regard to the injustices it's trying to expose and so forth. I'm just trying to understand what critique through self-critique would mean exactly, because yeah, I don't know. I found it very interesting.
I'm just going to read you a quote. And so, as I said a moment ago, because you're asking one of the core questions for my book, and Slavoj Žižek is one of the people I mention. I don't talk loads and loads about him, but I do mention him because he has been among the more influential figures, at least certainly within much of critical theory. So let me read you a quote from him, right? With which I begin part 2 of my book. Yes, the West is hypocritical, applying its high standards very selectively. But hypocrisy means you violate the standards you proclaim. And in this way, you open yourself up to inherent criticism. When we criticize the West, we use its own standards. That's exactly what I am doing for the left, which Zizek never even notices. He never even notices the irony of what he's saying. He's saying, we're only criticizing the West by using its own standards. That's good. I support that. I think it's clever. When does he criticize the left by using its own standards? He does just the opposite. He criticizes the left by saying, oh, well, we don't do that anymore. He criticizes Stalin and he criticizes, right, the Soviet Union and so forth, but as something which is done and dusted. It's in the past. That's not me. That's not us. So he doesn't understand what he himself is saying. And if he did, and if we did, we would have a much better left.
Thank you. I'm going to start wrapping proceedings up a bit, but I don't want to leave anyone in the position where they feel they want to make a point or ask a question, and we've left them out. So can I ask before we wind things up if anyone else has something to say? Yes.
Do you have anything to say about Corbyn in Syria specifically? And stop the war in Syria, actually, that movement, that galvanizing left movement that actually could have intervened in 2011, was it? And didn't. And it was ignominious.
I didn't get the whole question.
Do you have anything to say about...
As is Corbyn's support of Baathism.
It was about the left-wing stop the war in Syria movement. Do you have anything to say about it? The fact that they spoke out against the start of the Syrian civil war and Baathism.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, again, as far as, the core of my book is concerned, once again, it's, with the Middle East generally, whatever merits there may be to what much of the left is saying, there is simply too much amnesia about the left's own commitments to regimes which either indirectly or directly were involved in mass oppression throughout the Middle East. We just don't hear, again, I will say what I said before, show me the encampment where they're doing this. And if they're not doing this, what on earth does leftist self-scrutiny mean? What does it look like? Because that would be the golden opportunity, and yet we hear not a syllable of it.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the criticism. We've been talking a lot about what's wrong, but what do you see as the common root cause of this? Because it's not like there's only one group. It's not like one individual is doing this. And in that, what do you see as a possible solution? Because we're talking about a common problem that is across separate groups as well. So it's not just the stern talking to that is needed.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I do hope this is clear in the book, that the problem of hypocrisy is by no means just on the left. I hope I make that very clear in the book. And in fact, hypocrisy is not even a word which I use that much in the book. Because yes, there's always hypocrisy across this political spectrum. It's part and parcel of what it is to make broad commitments, without knowing what the future will bring, for example, or having to please many constituents that don't always have aligned interests. So you're absolutely right. If I'm talking about hypocrisy on the left, I am not meaning to say that it's only on the left. Far from it. Yeah. However, what is distinctive about the left, what it has always promised, and what I still consider to be its best hope, is to rise above tribalism. Because tribalism is when, yeah, everyone across the board just keeps ignoring their own hypocrisies, right? Just keeps finding all of the atrocities on the other side and not speaking about its own, right? And the left has fallen into that trap and has fallen into that trap for decades, but its salvation is in its original promise not to be tribal, not to be like all the others, not to think like all the others. And how has it always promised to do this, but too often failed to do it? Critique from a position of self-critique. It has to rediscover that. Again, many leftists think they do this, but they don't. And they cite me example after an example, and all they're talking about is strategy. They're not talking about self-critique.
I'll just add a little something. I'm going to get a bit ontological to address your query. And I'm going to talk specifically about the hard left, the sort of Marxist left in this case, and its constant pretension of claiming a moral high ground, for one, of claiming even scientific rigor. And here I'm borrowing from the great Leszek Kolakowski, who's not a household name, not studied in academia, but a great political thinker. The hard left relies on this utopian idea of change. It's got, let's say, a scatological horizon painted for scatoloid with an E, by the way, not with an S. Yeah. Okay. And in doing that, I don't think it leaves much room for autocriticism, for cultural nuance. And I think right now, to address the issue of the difficult position that the left finds itself, especially in the UK, is not being able to read, for example, those traditionalist values or conservative values that the working class has in the context specifically of the UK, what some people call blue Labour. And I think it has to do with this sort of ontological, materialistic in the philosophical sense of the word, construction of what leftism is. Yeah, that's my question.
So, thank you, Professor. I'm genuinely interested in your opinion on this, but you've previously mentioned the political spectrum and the words democracy and neutrality have previously come up. So, generally speaking, when we define democracy, we talk about rule by the people, for the people, and in which the political majority is rightfully represented without suppressing or undermining the representation of the political minority. And when we look at the political spectrum, so between the far right and the far left, some may argue that in order for democracy to be entirely achieved with no essence of corruption, that we must be politically neutral. But according to you and what you've said in your book, do you believe that democracy will ever be entirely achievable being politically neutral, or would we have to somehow be like left or right leaning?
Well, there's no such thing as political neutrality. I think that's a contradiction in terms, essentially, a mutual opposition, right? Either you're neutral or you're political. And I think that's not a bad thing, actually. Democracy does aim, if it's halfway decent, to provide a fair arena. And so that is a kind of claim to neutrality, right? An arena in which all can then participate as equals. But of course, we know that all in a democracy rarely are equal. There are always going to be power imbalances. Some democracies deal with that or redress that better than others. But I think what we're witnessing now, although it's always been latent, is just the fragility of democracy, right? Democracy can never just be a set of rules. There has to be a kind of faith in it. There has to be a trust in it. And once that erodes, it is so easy to overturn the whole democracy. And we're seeing this right and left
Sorry, I'd just like to add that I entirely agree. Democracy, it's extremely fragile, and I saw firsthand how it crumbled, you know, in front of my eyes in the case of Venezuela. As I said before, it wasn't the most functional democracy, but we had, you know, relatively independent institutions, a fair and relatively transparent electoral system, neutral electoral college, and all that was dismantled in, you know, less than 5 or so years. And interestingly, a colleague of mine, he's Rafael Uzcategui. I was talking to him the other day. He wrote a book called The Revolution as Spectacle, a letter to Noam Chomsky from an anarchist syndicalist, which is my colleague, Rafael Uzcategui. And he told me recently, you know, Ed, we know what Trump is capable of because we know what Chavez did. And they are both part of the same coin, two different faces of the same coin. So when you think about the alleged solidity of the US-American institutions, you know, legislative power, Congress, Senate, judiciary power, etc., you'd think, well, what happened in, you know, Nicaragua, Iran, Venezuela, that won't happen in the US. Well, you just got to think about the Weimar Republic, you know, and, you know, the successive years in the 1930s, what happened with the rise of Nazism. So it is very fragile. And, you know, as Margaret Cunningham, a great politologist, would say, populism and authoritarianism, sorry, is very much the shadow of democracy. It's right there, you know, looming around. So yeah, I'd like to just emphasize that, you know, we need to be constantly discussing openly, rationally about having this kind of fora. What do we want from democracy? Why do we need to protect it, to cherish it? What are the means? What's the role of the media as well? What are the roles of the educational institutions? Because I insist, it's a very fragile creature.
Let's end on a final. Oh no, you've got another question. All questions, but then we'll end with one final question to Professor Heinze to wrap things up after this.
There's a couple of questions from online. There's one from Veronica Majkowska. Hello, Veronica. If this discussion of the left mainly focuses on leftist academics and writers, do you think it's important to revive grassroots leftist politics to mobilize the public, especially in an era when far-right populists are becoming increasingly vocal and influential? So,
yeah, the focus on academics and writers is not meant to kind of immerse oneself in a tiny elite. The purpose of referencing academics and writers is because they often put their finger on trends that are much broader, and particularly those who exert influence, I would say. And you know, so I said at the beginning, right? So when I'm looking at, again, getting back to the title of my book, critical theory on the one hand, future of the left on the other hand, I don't see these as two separate departments, as two separate spheres that have nothing to do with each other. Quite on the contrary, I see constant influence back and forth. And does a grassroots need to be revived? Do ordinary citizens need to be more involved? Yes, always and everywhere. That's not recent. Always and everywhere, right? So the focus on academics and writers is not, you know, to look at a kind of an exclusive club, but really just, it's almost just a kind of shorthand to pinpoint, I think, broader currents that we're witnessing, but then up and down and throughout society, and not just among, you know, small handfuls of intellectuals.
Final question for you.
Thank you, Eric. I haven't read your book, but I look forward to it. I would just point out that basically center-left parties everywhere have declined through the rise of single-issue politics and identity politics. And they've also abandoned the main tenets of the left throughout history, which is democracy and equality. We're now living through increasing economic injustice, increasing inequality under so-called left-wing governments in the West. The abandonment of all class consciousness by left-wing parties has meant their embrace of identity victimhood. It's become a form of competitive victimhood, which for the left is a sort of moral high ground, which is basically the road to ruin. The road to ruin, because nobody can identify with it. And one of the problems with the left at the moment is that when they actually see justified grievances, they ignore them and just call them far right, which is why they've created a vacuum. Now they must pay the price.
I'm going to just wrap things up with a final question to Eric, which is, if I can quote from the very end of your book, you say, "It's time for the left to change course, not to do less critical theory, but to do more, not to become less woke, but to wager a new wokeness. The left that does this will be a left worth joining." So very briefly, you seem to suggest, despite all your criticism of the left, that it's still able to ride to the rescue of democracy, of all the wider themes that we've talked about. Do you think that, finally?
Only after it rides to the rescue of itself.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to Eric. Thank you to Ed. Thank you to everyone for coming. I think they're both going to hang around for a bit longer if you have questions you'd personally like to put to them. And I know that Eric's book is for sale on the back, which is an important thing to say. I've read it and I can recommend it.
And Paul, thank you very, very much.
That's exactly. I wanted to thank our panelists, the moderator, our audience online, to great questions and comments from you and from the audience there, and to thank Frontline Club for hosting us. I hope to see you to some of our next events. Thank you.